It has been 50 years since I last crossed the threshold of St. Helena's orphanage, yet even now, when the night turns heavy and the wind moves through the chimney, like a voice remembering how to cry, I can smell the lime, that white choking powder they used to scatter across the pit behind the chapel, so clean in its intention, so merciless in its purpose. I have not spoken of what we buried there, nor of the woman who led us to do it. But time, it seems, is a more patient confessor than any priest. The orphanage sat on the edge of Dublin's poorer district, a crooked structure of grey brick and frost-bitten iron. Its windows never caught the sun. They merely reflected the colour of the river, the same dull green that clung to the stones of the quay. I was a young curate then, sent by the diocese to oversee spiritual instruction among the sisters. They told me the place was a haven for the forgotten. I believed them. God help me, I did. The first time I met Sister Agnes, she was standing in the courtyard with a shovel, the hem of her habit soaked in mud. She was older than most of the sisters, her face pale as the candles she lit each dusk. There was something still about her, as though she had been carved from the same silence that filled the corridors. When she spoke, her voice barely disturbed the air. "Father Ronan," she said, "the children are sleeping. You'll find them quieter than most, quieter, yes." I would learn how cruelly true that word could be. At night St. Helena's grew smaller. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors narrowing with each prayer I whispered. The sisters moved like ghosts between doorways, their rosaries whispering against their skirts. Once I awoke to the sound of someone weeping beyond my cell wall. The voice was small, almost childlike, yet it carried an age-old grief. I called out, but the sound stopped at once, as if swallowed by the stones themselves. There were 13 graves behind the chapel, each marked by a modest cross of wood. They told me the infants had died of fever, unclaimed, unwanted, given only to the mercy of the church. The records were brief, no names, no baptisms. Sister Agnes tended to those graves herself, brushing the snow from each mound in winter, placing a wilted sprig of rosemary come spring. She said they were her children, though I knew she had never borne any of her own. One evening in March, as the bells of St. Patrick's tolled over the river, she asked me to bless the ground again. "For peace," she said. "They still stir." I thought she meant in her dreams. The chapel smelled of damp wood and tallow. The crucifix above the altar had begun to tilt, its nail eaten away by rust. As I murmured the Latin rite, I noticed her lips moving, not with the words of prayer, but with names. Names I did not recognize, spoken as if to soothe. When the candlelight caught her eyes, I saw something flicker there, something like relief, or perhaps surrender. Later that night, I found her kneeling in the courtyard, her hands buried in the earth, as if trying to reach what lay beneath. She did not look up when I spoke, only whispered, "They keep calling, Father. Even the lime cannot silence them." I wanted to believe it was madness born of grief. The fever had taken so many in those years. The sisters themselves were gaunt with exhaustion. Yet as I turned to leave, I thought I heard the faintest sound rise from the ground, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. I stood there, rooted, until the wind shifted and carried it away. The next morning I asked the Mother Superior about Sister Agnes's duties. Her face tightened. "She has served here longer than any of us," she said. "The Lord gives her strength to tend to what must be tended." "What must be tended?" I asked. But she would not answer. For weeks afterward, the air within St. Helena's grew thick with whispers. The younger sisters avoided the courtyard altogether. Some claimed they saw footprints appear in the mud after rain, small and shapeless, leading toward the graves. One sister swore she heard an infant cry from beneath the chapel floor. They sent her away to the infirmary soon after, and her name was never spoken again. I tried to reason with myself that grief and guilt can twist the senses. But each night I dreamed of 13 tiny hands pressing against the earth from below, of Sister Agnes's face pale in the moonlight, her lips moving as though in prayer but forming no sound I could bear to hear. I remember the morning she came to me with her confession. Her habit was torn, her hands raw with soil. She said she had seen them, that they were never buried right, that something beneath St. Helena's would not sleep until it was known. I asked her what she meant, but she only placed her hand over my mouth and whispered, "Not yet, Father. Not until you hear them too." That night the rain came harder than it had all spring. It beat against the chapel roof like knuckles against a coffin lid. I could not sleep. Every creak, every sigh of the old timbers sounded like breath returning to dead lungs. When at last I rose and went to the courtyard, I saw her there again, Sister Agnes, kneeling in the mud, the shovel beside her, the earth freshly turned. She looked up at me, her face streaked with rain and something darker. "It was never fever," she said. "It was choice." The words trembled in the air, heavy and unholy. I felt them settle deep within me, where faith once lived. That was the night everything changed. That was the night I first understood that silence can be a sin. And though I buried the truth as deep as those 13 small bodies, it has been rising ever since. It rises still. The following days blurred together in a haze of rain and unease. The sky above St. Helena's hung low and colourless, as if God himself refused to look upon the place. I tried to keep to my duties, morning mass, confessions, tending to the infirm, yet each prayer felt hollow, each hymn muffled beneath that ceaseless sound of dripping water. The sisters moved quietly, heads bowed, voices soft. No laughter, no warmth, no sound of children anymore, only the steady creak of floorboards and the distant tolling of bells that never seemed to end. I remember walking the corridor that led from the chapel to the nursery. The air there was colder, the light dimmer. The scent of milk and linen that once clung to the place had been replaced by something faintly metallic. On the wall a crucifix hung askew, the nails that held it blackened with damp. Beneath it a small cradle sat empty, its blanket folded neatly, as if awaiting a child that would never return. When I asked Sister Agnes about the infants, she said they were safe now. The words unsettled me, not for what they meant, but for how calmly she said them. She spoke of death as if it were a form of mercy, a sacrament unspoken by the Church. And I began to notice something else. She no longer wore her rosary. The chain that once hung at her waist was gone, replaced by a length of twine bound tightly around her wrist. That evening, she came to my cell with a lantern. Her face glowed pale in the flickering light, eyes wide, fevered with conviction. "They will not rest," she whispered. "Not until their names are spoken." I told her to rest, to pray, to leave such thoughts to the mercy of the Lord, but she only smiled, a weary, broken thing. "Do you think the Lord listens to this place, Father?" He turned his face long ago. I had no answer for her. Only silence, and in that silence I felt something shift, not in her but in me. That night the sound returned, a soft, rhythmic tapping from beneath the chapel floor, like fingers, like someone patiently waiting to be remembered. I lit a candle and went to the nave barefoot, the stone cold beneath my feet. The light trembled with each breath of wind. I stood before the altar listening. The air was still, heavy. Then the sound again, a faint knock. Then another. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear against the flagstones. The candle flickered, casting strange shapes along the pews. I could almost feel it, movement beneath me, a shallow stirring of the earth itself. I whispered a prayer, but the words came out wrong, tangled with fear. In the morning I found Sister Agnes already there. She had moved the altar aside, and a section of the floor was pried open, revealing damp soil beneath. She was digging, slow and methodical, her habit caked with mud. I shouted, demanded she stop, but she only kept repeating the same phrase. They were never baptized. They were never forgiven. When I tried to take the shovel from her, she looked at me with such fury that I stepped back. Her eyes, once so gentle, now burned with something close to revelation. "You buried them in silence," she hissed. "You sealed their mouths with lime, and now you ask for quiet." I wanted to tell her she was mistaken, that it was before my time, that I had no part in those burials, but even as the words formed, I knew they were lies. We were all part of it. Every priest, every nun who kept their eyes closed and their tongues still. We had called it mercy. We had called it God's will. That night the air in my room grew thick and wet. My candle sputtered, though there was no draught. I could smell the earth, fresh, open, raw. Then faintly beneath the floorboards came the sound again. This time not tapping, as breathing, a slow, shallow breath, as if something beneath me was alive. I did not move until dawn. Days later, the Mother Superior summoned me. Her expression was calm, almost cold. She said Sister Agnes had been moved to the infirmary for her own protection. "She has seen too much," the mother said. "You must not speak of it again. There are things best left buried, Father." I asked what would be done with the open floor in the chapel. She smiled faintly. "It will be resealed. God's house must remain whole." That night I went to see Agnes. She lay in her cot, eyes half open, lips cracked and grey. When she saw me, she reached out a trembling hand and whispered, "They have no names, Father. No names to carry them into heaven. Promise me you'll remember." I promised her, though I did not understand why. 2 days later she was gone. They told me she passed in her sleep peacefully. But when I went to bless her body, I found her eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if still listening for something that would not stop calling. The lime pit behind the chapel was filled once more that week. The sisters prayed, the earth settled, and the silence returned. Yet even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear the faint sound of her shovel, steady, desperate, and unending. I told myself it was grief, that I was imagining what guilt wanted me to see. But the next morning, when I returned to the chapel, the stone I had blessed at the altar was cracked clean in two, and beneath it, a single, tiny handprint pressed into the dust. The days that followed her passing were smothered in silence, not the holy silence of prayer, but the kind that feels alive, watchful. The sisters went about their duties with forced calm, their rosaries clattering like brittle bones in their trembling hands. I saw the fear in their faces, though none would speak it aloud. Death had always been our familiar companion, yet this was different. It was as if the air itself recoiled from the walls of St. Helena's. On the morning of her burial the rain returned, thin, cold, relentless. The ground behind the chapel had turned to mud, swallowing each step with a soft, wet sound. I was asked to perform the service, though the Mother Superior warned that no record of Sister Agnes's death was to be entered in the parish ledger. "She died in disgrace," she said. "We cannot risk scandal." But as I stood before the pit, words of the rite dying on my tongue, I saw the way her hands had been folded, not in prayer, but bound with twine just as she had worn around her wrist. Her eyes were closed now, yet her face held no peace. I bent close and whispered, "I remember, sister. I remember what you asked." That night I sat in my cell, unable to sleep. The chapel bell rang thrice, though there was no one to ring it. The wind rattled the glass, and the shadows stretched long across the floor, reaching toward me like slow, deliberate hands. I felt the weight of the promise I had made, a promise that pressed on my chest heavier than the collar I wore. When I could bear it no longer, I took my lantern and went again to the chapel. The cracked stone still bore the faint outline of the handprint. I knelt beside it, my fingers tracing the dust. "Who were you?" I whispered. "Who did we condemn to the earth without name?" And for the first time I heard something answer. Not a voice, but the soft rustle of soil shifting beneath the floor, a shallow, rhythmic stirring, then a faint whimper, thin as the cry of a newborn, fading almost as soon as it began. I stumbled backward, my lantern slipping from my hand. The light went out, and for a heartbeat I saw nothing. Only the smell, wet clay and decay thick enough to choke on. I fled the chapel. I wish I could say I prayed, but I did not. I could not. The words no longer felt like they belonged to me. The next morning, I was summoned again by the Mother Superior. She was waiting in her office, her expression grave, the crucifix behind her half shrouded in shadow. "You have been spending too much time near the chapel," she said. "The sisters have spoken of noises, of voices." I said nothing. "You will be reassigned," she continued. "There is work to be done at the infirmary in Rathmeans. Fresh air will cleanse your mind." But I could not leave. I told her so, that I had duties, confessions, unfinished rites. She looked at me as one looks upon a condemned man. "Do you not understand, Father? Some prayers are not meant to be answered." That night I went to the records room, lantern in hand. Dust lay thick on the ledgers. The ink had bled in the damp, turning names into ghosts. But I found the year 1852, the same year the chapel floor had first been sealed. There was a gap in the entries, a page torn clean from the binding. The numbers leapt from 43 to 57. 14 baptisms unrecorded, 13 infants unnamed, and there, written faintly in the margin of the next page, as if by a hesitant hand, "Sister Agnes, witness." I carried the ledger to my room and sat for hours, staring at the words. The candle burned low. I thought of her last breath, her plea that they be remembered. So I began to write. One by one I marked the page with numbers. No names, only the numbers she had murmured in her fever before she died. 13 small numbers written in trembling ink. When I finished, the candle sputtered and died. The room fell into darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw movement near the door, small shapes shifting like shadows caught in moonlight. I whispered the only thing I could. "You are seen. You are not forgotten." The air grew colder. I could hear faint laughter, not cruel but distant, echoing from beneath the floorboards. Then suddenly silence. In the morning I woke to find the ledger gone. The table where it had lain was bare save for a smear of mud and the faint outline of a child's footprint, no larger than my palm. I searched the convent, but none claimed to have seen it. The Mother Superior forbade further inquiry. She said, "Let the dead keep their peace." But peace had abandoned St. Helena's long ago, and that night, when the sisters gathered for evening prayer, I noticed the chapel candles flickering, though no wind touched them. Their flames bent, all in one direction, toward the floor. It was then I realized that Sister Agnes had not been wrong. The ground beneath St. Helena's was not silent. It was listening. I have often wondered what becomes of faith once it begins to rot, whether it crumbles quietly like damp paper, or whether it festers, breeding something darker in the hollow spaces where belief once lived. By the autumn of that year I'd begun to learn the answer. St. Helena's changed after Sister Agnes's burial. The air inside the chapel grew heavier, as though every breath carried the weight of some unsung grief. The sisters spoke little. Their eyes darted to corners when none should have been afraid. And at night, the corridors echoed with faint sounds, scraping, whispering, and once unmistakably, the soft gurgle of a baby trying to draw breath where none lived. I tried to convince myself that it was the wind. Dublin's damp has a way of finding its voice through every crack and seam, yet deep down, I knew the wind did not whisper names. One evening, as the last of the sunlight bled through the chapel windows, I found the Mother Superior kneeling before the altar. She did not rise when I entered, nor did she look at me. Her voice came thin, distant. "I have had dreams," she said. "They stand at the foot of my bed, all 13. Not one of them has eyes. I remember the candlelight trembling between us." "Then you must pray, Mother," I told her. "I have," she whispered, and it only made them come closer. That night I sat alone in the confessional. The wooden booth smelled of mildew and candle smoke. Hours passed without a single soul entering, yet the curtain shifted, slow and deliberate. I heard breathing, soft, wet and uneven like a sick child struggling to inhale. I forced myself to speak, though my voice cracked. "In the name of the Father, who comes before me," no answer. Only that breathing, and then the sound of tiny fingernails scratching against the lattice between us. I fled before I could open the door. In the days that followed, I began to see things. Small handprints in the dust beneath the pews, drops of water, or was it blood, on the marble steps that led to the altar. Once I found the baptismal font filled not with water but with dark, stagnant mud. I asked the sisters if they had seen who did it. None had, but their silence said enough. They feared speaking more than the thing itself. The Mother Superior grew ill. Her voice weakened, her eyes sunk into shadow. She forbade any mention of Sister Agnes's name, and yet her own chamber reeked of the same wet earth that clung to the chapel floor. I prayed for strength, but prayer had become like talking into a grave. God did not answer, or perhaps he did in ways too terrible to understand. Then one night I returned to the chapel and found it unlocked. The candles were already burning, though I had not lit them. The altar cloth had been pulled down, and in its place someone had laid a rosary made entirely of small white bones. I did not touch it. My stomach turned as I saw the twine still knotted around the cross, the same rough thread Sister Agnes had worn upon her wrist. I knelt there until dawn, unable to move, unable to breathe. I knew then that whatever she had done, whatever she had tried to atone for, had not ended with her death. The children beneath that floor were restless, and the earth that held them refused to forget. The next morning I told the Mother Superior that I wished to dig. "If the dead call to us," I said, "then it is our duty to answer." Her response was quiet, almost a whisper. "And if the dead no longer wish to be saved?" I did not reply. That evening I returned with a lantern and a shovel. The air was damp, the stone cold beneath my knees. As I began to dig, the sound was almost deafening. Metal striking earth, breath echoing in the hollow chamber of the church. After only a few inches, the soil grew black and soft, heavy with moisture. It smelled of something sweet and rotten. And then I found it, a scrap of cloth, white once, now grey with age. I pulled gently, and a small bundle came free. Within it lay what I could not mistake, the faint curve of a skull no larger than my fist. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed to stop. But beneath that single skull, I saw more, the outline of others, smaller still, pressed together like a congregation in the earth. 13. A whisper escaped my lips. Not prayer, not language, just sound. I covered them again, trembling so violently I thought my heart would give out. As I stood to leave, I saw something glint in the dirt, a rosary bead half buried. I reached for it, but when my fingers brushed the soil it pulsed, a faint living throb, as though the earth itself drew breath. I fell backward, the lantern tipping, spilling light across the floor. For an instant I saw them, the faint silhouettes of children's faces, pressed into the dirt, watching. Then darkness swallowed everything again, and in that silence I heard Sister Agnes's voice, faint, broken, almost kind. "They are not gone, Father, only waiting." For 3 days after I unearthed those small bones, I did not sleep. The earth clung to my hands no matter how I washed them, a dark, sticky film that smelled of rain and old iron. Each night I heard faint bells tolling from the chapel steeple, though no one had rung them since Sister Agnes's burial. The sisters whispered among themselves now, their faces pale beneath their hoods, their eyes red-rimmed from fear and prayer. I tried to convince them that the ringing was only the wind, a trick of the coastal fog. But deep down I knew that St. Helena's had begun to breathe again. Something beneath the stone had stirred. On the 4th night the bells tolled 13 times. I counted them aloud as I walked through the cloister, each one slower than the last, each one fading into an echo that seemed to travel not through air, but through the marrow of my bones. By the final toll the air was still. I remember thinking that the silence afterward felt heavier than sound itself. I found the Mother Superior waiting by the chapel door. She looked older, impossibly so, her skin grey, her eyes glassy. In her trembling hands she held the same rosary of bone I had seen upon the altar. "They have been heard," she said. "She has woken them." "Who?" I asked, though the answer was already alive in my mind. "Sister Agnes," she whispered. She prayed for forgiveness, but what she brought instead was remembrance. The door behind her creaked open on its own. I smelled the earth again, that cold, damp sweetness that rose from the floorboards. The chapel glowed with candlelight, though no candles burned. And in the faint light I saw movement, 13 small figures standing before the altar, shrouded in dust and shadow. Their faces were pale as ash, their eyes dark hollows that reflected the flicker of something unseen. I could not move. The Mother Superior began to weep. "They were never baptized," she said. "Agnes kept them secret, thinking she spared their souls. But now they want names." I tried to speak, to offer prayer, but the words caught in my throat. The air was thick, pressing against my chest, filling me with a cold so deep it felt like drowning. The smallest of the figures stepped forward. It carried something in its hands, a piece of cloth torn and wet. When I looked closer, I saw the faint embroidery of a cross. "Father," it said, a whisper no louder than breath. "Say our names." I fell to my knees. The Mother Superior began reciting the baptismal rite, her voice trembling but steady enough to hold the silence at bay. One by one she named them, names she could not have known, yet they came effortlessly, as though spoken through her by some unseen force. With each name, the figures faded. Their outlines softened, their small hands fell away like smoke. The air warmed, and the light dimmed until only one candle remained lit on the altar. When the last name was spoken, that candle flickered, then died. We sat there in darkness, unable to move. At dawn, the chapel floor was undisturbed. The earth I had dug was smooth once more, the marble clean. The rosary of bone had vanished. The bells did not ring again. The Mother Superior fell ill the next morning and passed within the week. Her body was buried beside Sister Agnes, beneath the ivy wall that overlooked the sea. The remaining sisters soon dispersed, some to other convents, some to silence. St. Helena's was closed by the diocese a year later. I left Dublin not long after, but even now when the wind comes from the east, I sometimes hear those bells again, faint, uneven, always 13. And in their echo I remember the chapel, the earth, and the small, unseen hands that once reached from beneath the floor, begging only to be named. It has been many years since I left that place, but the memory clings like mildew to the corners of my mind. There are nights when the scent of wet limestone fills my room, though I live far from the sea now. The walls seem to breathe, and for a moment I feel the cold flagstones beneath my knees again, the same stones where 13 nameless souls once waited to be spoken into peace. After I fled Dublin, I served in smaller parishes, places too poor to have their own cemeteries, where the dead were buried in shared ground and forgotten by winter. I carried St. Helena's with me like a sickness. I found myself staring too long at the soil, at the places where grass refused to grow. I heard small knocks beneath my floorboards and told myself it was the rats. I told myself a great many things. Years passed. My hair went white. My sermons became shorter, quieter, filled with long pauses I could not explain. I noticed the congregation would not meet my eyes anymore. They said I prayed to silence more than to God. One evening, a messenger arrived from Dublin, a young cleric carrying a folded letter sealed with the mark of the archdiocese. His hands trembled as he handed it to me, though he would not say why. The letter was written in the same fine ink I remembered from St. Helena's ledgers. It said only this: "The earth has opened once more." Below those words was the signature of Father Bayern, the man who had replaced me. That night I could not sleep. The candles in my chamber burned too quickly, their wax falling like tears onto the table. I tried to pray, but the words tangled together. Names, half-remembered hymns, fragments of the burial rites. I thought of Sister Agnes, of her narrow face and trembling hands. I thought of the Mother Superior's final breath, and I realized something terrible. Perhaps it was not the children who had been freed that night. Perhaps it was her. The next morning I packed my cassock and set out for Dublin once more. The city greeted me as it always had, with fog and the smell of horse dung and the far-off toll of church bells. Yet St. Helena's was no longer the proud, ivy-covered house I remembered. Its windows were boarded, the gate sealed with iron chain. A government notice was nailed to the door. Unsafe for habitation. Still, I forced the lock and entered. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else beneath it, something sharp and metallic, the smell of earth freshly turned. I followed it down the nave, past the pews covered in cobwebs until I reached the altar. The floor was open again. The same square of marble I had pried up years ago lay beside the pit. And in the soil below I saw not bones but roots, black and glistening, pulsing faintly as though alive. They reached outward, spreading through the foundation like veins through a body. The sound of bells began softly above me. One toll, then another, then 13 in total. But these were not church bells. They came from beneath. I dropped to my knees. The ground trembled. The air filled with a low, steady moan, the sound of stone grinding against stone. A cold draught swept through the chapel, carrying the faint scent of milk and blood. Something whispered my name. It was not a child's voice. It was hers. I felt her near me, not as flesh but as weight, as air that pressed upon my chest until I could barely breathe. I heard the scrape of bare feet on stone, the soft drag of cloth. "Agnes," I said, my voice breaking, "you were forgiven." But the whisper came again, closer this time. "No one is forgiven, Father." Then silence. The floorboards closed with a sound like thunder. Dust fell from the rafters. The candles extinguished themselves in unison. I stumbled backward, gasping, and when I reached the doorway, I turned and saw her standing before the altar, her habit soaked and clinging to her frame, her face turned downward as if in prayer. The bells stopped. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone. That was 20 years ago. Yet sometimes, when I wake in the small hours of the night, I feel her presence at the foot of my bed, the smell of damp wool and the faint sound of dripping water. I no longer pray for peace. Peace is a mercy for the innocent, and I'm not innocent, because I know now what those children were. Not lost, not abandoned, but offered, and I was the one who spoke their names. When I returned from St. Helena's that final time, I believed I had escaped. I left the city behind me like a man fleeing a fire he himself had lit. I took refuge in a seaside parish north of Wicklow, a crumbling chapel built on cliffs that crumbled faster than faith itself. There were fewer eyes there, fewer questions, only the ocean and the fog, and the wind that smelled of rot and salt. For a while I pretended the silence meant forgiveness, but silence has its own voice, and mine spoke only through the sea. Each night it struck the rocks like the beating of 13 small fists, muffled beneath the floor of heaven. I tried to bury myself in routine. I baptized infants. I read psalms to the dying. I listened to confessions that sounded cleaner than my own. But with every prayer, I felt the earth breathing beneath my feet as though waiting to be disturbed again. Months passed before the first sign came. It began with the parish bell. One dawn I found it tolling without wind or hand to guide it. It rang 13 times slowly, each note quivering through the damp air. I climbed the tower to stop it, but the rope hung slack. I stood there in the mist, watching the grey sea churn below, and knew that someone, had followed me from Dublin. That night, I dreamt of Sister Agnes again. She stood beside the altar at St. Helena's, her eyes pale as ash, her lips moving in prayer. Behind her the 13 small coffins were open, their lids laid neatly in a row. She turned to me, and for a moment I thought she smiled. Then she whispered, "You baptized them in lies." I woke choking on seawater. The sheets were damp, though it had not rained. My hands smelled faintly of iron. I began to forget my sermons after that. My mind faltered during Mass. Parishioners said I spoke names no one knew, names that were not in the book. Once during a funeral I lowered the wrong coffin into the ground, a man buried where a child was meant to rest. I told them it was grief that clouded me, but grief has a shape. This was something shapeless. One evening I received another letter, though this one bore no seal. The handwriting was careful, feminine and faintly familiar. It said, "They were not yours to forgive, there was no signature. Only a pressed flower within the fold, a withered white bloom I recognized from the gardens of St. Helena's, a lily, brittle and brown. After that, I could no longer bear to sleep indoors. I began wandering the cliffs at night, lantern in hand, listening to the surf below. The sea looked black under the moon, endless and cold. Once I thought I saw small figures moving along the rocks, crawling like shadows toward the tide. But when I blinked, they were gone. On the 7th night I found something waiting at the chapel door, 13 small stones, laid carefully in a circle. Each stone marked with a single letter, carved deep and uneven. I knelt to read them. Together they spelled one word: remember. I stood there for a long time, unable to move. The lantern flame shivered as though the night itself breathed against it. I took the stones inside, laid them on the altar, and whispered a prayer I barely understood. But as I spoke, I heard a faint sound from beneath the chapel floor, soft and rhythmic, like breathing. The earth moved almost imperceptibly, and I realized it was not the sea I'd been hearing all along. It was the ground itself exhaling. I wanted to flee again, to vanish into the fog, to let the cliffs take me, but my legs would not obey. Something stronger than fear held me there, listening to that buried pulse, and slow, patient, and alive. Then came the 13th breath, and with it a whisper. So close it felt inside my ear. You cannot leave what you helped make. The lantern went out. I remember that darkness more than I remember my own name. For many nights after, I wandered the cliffs in silence, clutching the broken lantern like a relic of light that no longer belonged to me. The stones I had taken from the chapel, the ones that spelled remember, I carried in a small cloth sack tied beneath my coat. I could not leave them behind. When I tried once throwing them into the sea, the tide returned them by morning, laid neatly at the chapel door once again. They were not meant to be discarded. They were meant to follow. There is a weight that does not belong to the living, a kind that presses down from the soil beneath, not the sky above. I began to feel that weight in my bones, as though the earth had found its way into me, turning marrow to mud. My steps grew slower, my breath shorter. The doctor said it was age. I knew better. It was inheritance. The sea near Wicklow had a peculiar stillness that year. Even the gulls flew low, circling the cliffs as though afraid to touch the water. Once, while I prayed at dawn, I saw something floating among the waves. Not driftwood, not debris, but what looked like a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. It rocked with the tide for several minutes before sinking beneath the grey surface, leaving behind only a pale ring of foam. I told myself it was a fisherman's net or a trick of light. But I could not pray again that morning. By midsummer the villagers had begun to whisper. They said the chapel bells rang at odd hours, that a woman's voice could be heard singing lullabies when the mist rolled in from the sea. They asked if I had heard it too. I told them no, but I had known every night since the 13th breath beneath the chapel floor. Her voice was soft, careful, and terribly patient. It carried through the fog like smoke, repeating a single verse. 13 born and 13 gone, 13 souls to make us one. The words never changed. They drifted from the cliffs, sometimes from beneath the soil, sometimes from within my own chest. I began to lose track of where I ended, and the voice began. One storm-heavy evening, the sea rose high enough to strike the chapel wall. I stayed inside, clutching the altar like a man drowning above water. The air was heavy with salt and candle smoke. Then, without warning, the floor beneath me shifted, not violently, but with the subtle, deliberate movement of something awakening. The old boards cracked open, splitting in a jagged line that led straight to the altar's base. Beneath the splintered wood I saw darkness, deeper than any earthly shadow. The smell that rose from it was unmistakable, the same damp rot that had filled St. Helena's crypt. I fell to my knees trembling, as a faint sound rose from the void, not crying, not wind. Breathing, one by one, I heard them draw in air. 13 small breaths, each perfectly spaced, each followed by a faint hum, as though remembering the lullaby that once sent them to sleep. I covered the opening with the altar cloth, pressed my hand against it, and begged, not for forgiveness but for silence. Yet the breaths continued, soft and rhythmic, like waves beneath the earth. At dawn I went to the shore. I wanted to wade into the sea and let it claim me, to let the tide strip me of memory. But when I stepped into the water, it recoiled. The waves broke around me, forming a ring of stillness, untouched and hollow. The ocean itself would not take me. So I knelt there, knee-deep in the cold surf, and understood. My confession had not been heard by God. It had been heard by them, and they were not finished listening. That night, I dreamt again of the crypt at St. Helena's, only this time I was not looking down at the 13 coffins. I was inside one of them, the smallest. I felt the lid close above me, the nails driven in. The sound was slow and merciful. Through the darkness I heard her voice one last time, close enough to feel on my skin. You will remember for all of us. When I woke, my pillow was damp with salt water, and the smell of the sea filled the room, though the window had been closed all night. The next morning the stones were gone. All 13, but their word "remember" remained carved faintly into the chapel floorboards, and beneath it, faintly, almost like a heartbeat, the 13th breath still moved. There are nights when I wake before dawn, my breath caught between prayer and drowning. I no longer know which I am doing. The chapel stands hollow now, its doors swollen shut with damp, its pews leaning inward like witnesses grown weary of the same confession. No one comes to Mass anymore. No one dares. The last parishioner who entered left before the sermon ended, trembling, saying she'd seen a cradle swaying near the altar, though no cradle had stood there in 30 years. I keep the habit still, vestments over thin shoulders, chalice polished, though the wine has long since turned to dust. I whisper the liturgy to the empty seats, each word echoing off the stone like a moth trapped in glass. The sound of my voice no longer feels like my own. The heart quivers, drifts, returns to me changed, younger, higher, almost childlike. I try not to listen, but there is something inside those echoes that remembers what I have tried to forget. On the 9th evening of Lent, a fog rolled inland from the sea. Thick and yellowed, it swallowed the town, turned lamplight to dull amber orbs. I watched from the chapel steps as it climbed the graveyard wall, curling around the headstones like fingers. In that murk, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing by the church gate, still unhurried as though waiting for permission to enter. I called out. No reply. Only the slow creak of iron hinges as the gate swung open. When I turned to fetch the lantern, I saw footprints forming across the chapel floor one by one, wet with salt water. They stopped before the altar, and then silence. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, for when she finally appeared, she was not as I remembered her. The habit clung to her like seaweed, her veil damp and heavy, her hands clasped as if in prayer, but her eyes were closed. Sister Agnes had been buried 40 years, and yet she knelt before me with the same quiet devotion as she once did in life. I wanted to speak, to ask what she sought, but my tongue felt carved from wood. The air around her shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from the floor. She whispered something, and faint, wet, and familiar. A lullaby. 13 born and 13 gone, 13 souls to make us one. Then she placed her hands upon the altar. The boards beneath her feet began to darken, not from shadow but from moisture. Sea water pooled in the cracks, rising slowly, filling the chapel with the smell of brine and decay. I stumbled backward, but my knees failed me. The tide rose higher, swirling around the pews, carrying with it small white shapes. Not flowers, not wax, but the fragile bones of infants, clean as pearl. They floated toward the altar and sank beneath her robes, one after another, as if returning home. Her head lifted then. Her eyes opened. They were black, not from rot, but from depth. I saw the reflection of the sea inside them, vast and endless. She looked at me, and in that gaze I understood what I had refused to see all these years. The 13th prayer was never meant for God. It was meant for me. I felt her hand touch my chest. Cold, deliberate, my heart faltered beneath it. She did not speak, but I heard the words as if carved into my ribs. You carried their breath. Now carry their memory. And just like that, she was gone. The water receded. The bones vanished. The candles guttered out. I was alone again, but not empty. Inside me, beneath the weight of every heartbeat, I could hear it, 13 heartbeats, faint and synchronized, echoing mine. I tried to write it down that night, to put every sound, every shape, every word upon paper. But the ink bled across the page as though the story itself refused to stay still. I burned the journal, yet the smell of salt and smoke clung to my hands for days. Since that night I've not left the chapel. I cannot. The graves beyond the wall call to me, and I fear what might follow if I answer. I no longer pray for forgiveness. I pray for forgetting. But the world does not forget what was buried in God's name. And every morning, before the sun lifts over Dublin, I hear them again. Faint cries beneath the floorboards, the soft rhythm of breath that should not exist. 13 small voices murmuring the same single word. Father, it is not accusation. It is remembrance. And I have no answer to give them. I think perhaps the final Mass will come soon, not with congregation, but with reckoning. The walls seem thinner each day. The sea scent stronger. Even now, as I write, the candles bend toward the floor, drawn to the sound below. Something moves beneath the chapel. Something that remembers me by name. It is morning, though no light reaches the chapel. The fog outside has thickened into something solid, and the air within smells of iron and mildew. I can barely lift my hands now. They tremble too much to hold the chalice, too much even to write. I believe this will be my final testimony. My last attempt at making words carry the weight my heart cannot. The quill bleeds faster than my breath. I dreamt again last night, though dream is a gentle word for it. I saw the sea rising past the parish walls, flooding the town in silence. Not a storm, not wrath, only still water, swallowing the cobblestones and doorsteps like memory reclaiming its debt. Beneath that pale surface floated the faces of children, calm, eyes closed, lips half-parted, as if still singing the old hymn. And behind them, in the shadow where light should have been, stood Sister Agnes. She did not move. She only watched. And in her stillness I knew what she wanted. There are moments when I think she was right, that no act of penance can erase what was done here, that some sins are meant to linger as warnings, rather than be washed away. But there is another part of me, small and childish still, that believes confession can unmake a curse. So I write, though my ink grows thin and my memory fractures with each line. When the first child died, we told ourselves it was fever. When the second followed, we spoke of contagion. By the 5th, the midwives stopped attending births altogether. It was Agnes who insisted the bodies remain here, within the house of God. She said the church was safer than the earth. But safety is a word we used to hide our fear. I see that now, 13 infants, 13 unmarked graves beneath St. Helena's. No records, no headstones, only silence heavy as ash. Agnes said she prayed over each one, though I remember her hands trembling as she held the last. I remember how she looked at me, not with blame but with mercy. And that was the cruelest thing of all. The bishop came once, years later. He asked for explanations, for names. I gave him neither. By then the ground beneath the chapel had begun to shift, soft, uneven, like something breathing below. He did not stay long. He told me to keep the door shut, to let the dead rest. But they never did. Now the floorboards move again, faintly, like waves under the planks. I hear them in the walls, in the beams, in the sound between my heartbeats. I think the sea has found its way back here. Or perhaps it never left. The wood is swollen with damp, and the candle flames bow low as though in mourning. I went down once more beneath the altar, where the stone breaks into earth. The air was cold and salt-bitten. My lantern barely held its flame. I saw what remained, not flesh, not decay, but white roots, thin as veins, stretching through the soil in all directions, and from within that tangled nest a small sound, a sigh, like the breath of something sleeping. I knelt, I touched the earth. It was warm. It is strange what warmth can mean in a place like this. Not comfort, not life, only proof that something still remembers. I do not think this place can be sanctified again. The walls are cracked, and the bells above the nave have long ceased to ring. I have prayed until my tongue feels like paper, but no sound carries beyond the fog. The parish is gone, the people gone with it. Only I remain, and the house of God that became a tomb long before my time. I have set one candle on the altar. It burns low, its wax bleeding down the sides like tears. When it dies, I will open the doors. I will walk into the fog and let the sea take me, as it has taken everything else. If anyone finds this, let them know. The 13th prayer is not to be spoken. It was not written for salvation. It was written for remembrance, that what we buried beneath St. Helena's would never sleep, and that those who prayed over their silence would be bound to it forever. I am ready now. My breath is shallow, the cold creeping through my chest. I think I can hear them again. 13 voices, soft as the turning tide, whispering the same single word. Home. The candle flickers once, then stills. The wax pools. The fog presses against the stained glass, like the sea against the hull of a sinking ship. And somewhere beneath the chapel floor, something exhales, long and slow like the last breath of the world. I pray once more, though I no longer know to whom. May they rest, I whisper, even if I cannot. The light fades. The ink stops, and with it so do I.